In 1867, Timothy Caldwell's behavior unsettled an entire Missouri community, but 19th-century medicine had no framework to interpret what they witnessed. Forensic psychology today can shed new light on those same actions, drawing connections his neighbors could never have imagined. When placed against DSM-5 criteria for childhood conduct disorders, a pattern begins to emerge, one that resonates with the kinds of data modern researchers now track in juvenile cases of violence. This video combines historical storytelling with contemporary psychiatric insight and statistical context. To understand Timothy, though, we must first understand the wounded landscape in which he grew. The Missouri backdrop. Missouri in 1867 was a place marked not by recovery but by fatigue. The war had ended, yet its traces were everywhere, etched into the countryside and into the behavior of the people who lived there. Once thriving farmland in places like Pettis County lay dotted with half-collapsed barns, unused fields, and homes whose occupants had either not returned from battle or had been forced to abandon their properties. The land seemed held in suspension, not destroyed but not restored. It carried the look of something interrupted, its silence heavy and unsettled. The human cost was even more visible. Communities had lost thousands of men, some permanently, others returned but unable to resume the lives they once led. Survivors carried scars that were both physical and psychological. Men hobbled along roads on crutches, or else drank to dull memories they could not escape. Women managed farms and debts left behind by husbands or brothers, while children grew up knowing responsibility long before they were ready. Everyday life meant keeping things running however one could, even if it meant bending under burdens too large to carry. Neighbors leaned on each other, but grief and debt thinned their trust. Bonds did not disappear, but they grew fragile and reluctant, shaped as much by necessity as loyalty. This collective exhaustion shaped how people interpreted what they saw in the children among them. A boy who stood apart from others, quiet, contemplative, or seemingly hardened to life, was not usually seen as cause for worry. Adults were inclined to read such traits as endurance or maturity. With every household carrying its share of loss, nobody had the will to investigate unusual behavior too closely. A child who never seemed to cry or flinch might have been viewed not with suspicion but with respect, his silence taken as a sign that he had learned to carry grief as stoically as the adults around him. Grief had made stillness seem like strength, and communities accepted that appearance as enough. This tendency was heightened by the level of trauma the community itself carried. People numbed by repeated tragedy no longer distinguished sharply between chance misfortune and patterns that might suggest deeper danger. A neighbor dying in an accident or livestock found dead seemed unremarkable in a place where death had been everywhere for years. Misfortune blended together, and individual incidents rarely stood out against the broader landscape of collective loss. Adjusting to disaster had become a survival strategy, and its effect was to dull awareness of subtler warning signs. The absence of medical expertise only deepened this blind spot. Outside larger towns like Jefferson City or St. Louis, doctors were few, and their practices remained focused overwhelmingly on the wounds of battle or the scourge of epidemic diseases. Their vocabulary for psychological conditions in children was limited, and the newer field of psychiatry had yet to settle even its most basic debates. In practice, this meant minor behavioral concerns were not medicalized. No physician would have been summoned to examine a child simply because he seemed distant or oddly composed. Such things were not understood as problems but as quirks of personality, or as the natural hardening that war created in everyone. Religious authority, often the other institution people turned to, struggled in similar ways. Ministers were stretched thin, occupying themselves with steady reminders of faith and endurance. From the pulpit, their words urged believers to continue bearing their hardships with dignity, not to scrutinize each other's failings. This was not neglect but priority setting. Shepherding despairing congregations required sermons about hope and survival, not about probing why an individual child seemed pulled further inward than his peers. Clergy, like neighbors and family members, naturally assumed that odd behavior reflected wartime grief, not hidden pathology. Even the land seemed to reflect the same unease. Border conflicts, raids, and bursts of violence had left soil and communities unsettled. The cessation of formal fighting did not mean an end to conflict. Armed skirmishes, robberies, and reprisals continued into the late 1860s, an undercurrent of instability that shadowed daily routines. The people of Missouri lived with an expectation of disruption, a sense that calamity might visit at any moment, when not from war, then from weather, sickness, or sudden financial collapse. In this atmosphere, unusual behavior from a child hardly registered at all. In fact, it often seemed less alarming than everything else families faced. Within households, children were expected to work and contribute as soon as they were able. Families rebuilding farms could not afford the luxury of childhood idleness. A boy who worked without complaint or did not engage in trivial squabbles could seem like a blessing. Efficiency and discipline were valued, while childish play or noisy defiance were more likely to draw disapproval. Against such a metric, a child who kept to himself and consistently did as he was told would have seemed unusually responsible, even admirable. Adults often mistook restraint for maturity, and in doing so overlooked the possibility that something else might be concealed beneath that polished surface. Silence became a hallmark of this environment. The social world was quieter, flatter, its edges worn by years of grief and struggle. People measured speech as carefully as they measured grain or firewood. Within such a culture of reserve, Timothy's quietness did not raise alarms. To most, it appeared to be another example of how children adapted quickly, learning the language of restraint their elders modeled daily. Peculiarities could vanish against this background of enforced composure. Neighbors chose reassurance over suspicion, because reassurance helped keep the fragile sense of normalcy intact. Modern research on trauma helps to clarify how such a climate could mask deeper dangers. Diagnostic work today shows how heavily trauma shapes the behavior of children, often producing responses that appear resilient but conceal distress or disturbance. Communities themselves can normalize silence and composure, further blurring the line between ordinary coping and emerging pathology. These insights were not available in 1867. To the people of post-war Missouri, the tools for distinguishing between adaptation and disorder simply did not exist. This climate of exhaustion, scarcity, and limited understanding set the stage for how Timothy Caldwell was received. His behavior was interpreted through the lens of the war's legacy rather than through suspicion of anything darker. Community members assumed endurance where modern eyes might identify warning signs. It was within this landscape, scarred and weary, practical to the point of blindness, that his presence became just one more feature of a damaged world. And it was within this same landscape that his childhood began to take shape. Quiet on the surface, yet carrying the first traces of unease others felt but could not quite define. A child out of place. Timothy's childhood marked him as different almost from his arrival. At 8 years old, he slipped into the farm's routine with striking precision, rising at dawn, finishing chores without resistance, sitting through school lessons and church services without complaint. Records describe him as punctual and polite, the kind of boy who required little correction. To adults worn thin by hardship, this obedience looked like virtue. While other children squirmed during sermons or resisted long hours in the fields, Timothy sat straight-backed and quiet, receiving instruction with a calmness that felt unusual. Yet for some who paid attention, his stillness carried an uncanny quality, too measured, too deliberate, as though he were performing the role of a child more than embodying one. Others around him noticed the gap that separated Timothy from his peers. At school, he joined games when rules demanded it but never seemed invested in them. He watched disagreements between classmates without ever joining, and his responses to teasing were absence rather than reaction. No tears, no anger, no laughter to brush it aside. Even when he did smile, it seemed borrowed, a gesture more learned than lived. Teachers remembered his work as exact and efficient. He copied lines with tidy handwriting, finished tasks quickly, and then sat immobile at his desk, waiting for direction rather than seeking new challenges. Adults applauded this restraint, grateful for a child so easy to manage, but other observers found it disquieting. Childhood energy was missing, replaced by something cooler, heavier, more controlled. Life on the farm echoed these impressions. His uncle Thomas saw usefulness in Timothy's labor, hauling, feeding, carrying, performed with determination but without chatter. His Aunt Sarah's reaction was more complex. She did not accuse him of laziness or defiance, but described him uneasily as a boy who watched more than he played. Her words hinted at what others also perceived. Timothy seemed distant even within the household, present in body but detached from the rhythms of ordinary family life. Social gatherings produced the same mixed responses. Neighbors praised his courtesy. He greeted adults formally, refrained from shouting, and stayed still where other children grew noisy. One or two even admired his composure, contrasting it with the rowdiness they struggled to manage in their own homes. Yet such restraint unsettled others. They noticed how he stood slightly apart, how he appeared indifferent to the bonds and quarrels that drew children together. Where most boys his age chased, argued, or clung to siblings, Timothy remained composed, as though untouched by the impulses of play. The absence of visible emotion, no sulking, no delight, no restless curiosity, left some parents uneasy without knowing exactly why. A few fragments from the school and church records sketch the same profile. Timothy's handwriting, precise for his years, was praised as unusually sharp. His memory impressed teachers. He could repeat readings word for word, rarely missing a detail. But when he was asked about meaning or morals, his answers seemed flat, spoken as though memorized rather than felt. He recited lessons without warmth, never adding personal reflections. Adults attributed this to grief, a natural silence in a child who had lost much. That assumption allowed peers and neighbors alike to explain away the strangeness. There were still whispers of something beyond grief. Some spoke of his gaze, eyes that fixed on scenes with unwavering intensity. When animals struggled in a pen or scavenged at feed, Timothy's stares lingered not with concern but with a detached curiosity. It was as if he was recording what he saw for reasons he never shared. Adults inclined to favor him misread this poise as attentiveness. Yet others could not shake the feeling that his interest was unnervingly impersonal, the look of someone studying rather than empathizing. Modern frameworks allow us to recognize these descriptions as matching known warning signs. The DSM-5 outlines several features relevant to what Timothy displayed, especially within discussions of conduct problems. Most striking are what later editions of DSM-5 call limited prosocial emotions, a specifier added for certain cases of conduct disorder. This category highlights a subgroup of children who exhibit traits such as lack of remorse, lack of empathy, and shallow affect. Field trial estimates in child psychiatry settings place this specifier at about 5% of outpatient cases. Although not a population statistic, it captured clinicians' recognition of a high-risk class of symptoms. Timothy's blank detachment, his shallow laughter and absence of emotional reciprocity echo these red flags. Behavior praised by his community, his composure, his disinterest in quarrels, his mechanical recall of lessons, aligns with precisely the qualities modern clinicians monitor with special caution. Importantly, clinicians today avoid describing such children simply as psychopathic. In child psychology, the preferred descriptions remain tied to DSM-5 categories: conduct disorder with the limited prosocial emotions specifier. Language of psychopathy is not generally applied to children since it is considered both inaccurate and stigmatizing. The relevance lies not in affixing a label to Timothy, but in noting that his patterns fit a profile of behaviors recognized as concerning, behaviors that often precede more overt forms of harm. From the perspective of his time, however, none of this was visible. Discipline, responsibility, silence, these were cultural ideals, traits valued in adults and admired in children when they appeared prematurely. Timothy's avoidance of play seemed like seriousness, his lack of mischief seemed like maturity, and his detachment was framed as stoicism in the face of loss. In praising him, the community lost sight of what might have been hiding beneath the surface. Through this gap between historical perception and modern insight, we see how easily strength can be mistaken for safety. Timothy worked, obeyed, and refrained from disruption, but he remained a part, an observer rather than a participant, a child polite enough to be pleasing but hollow enough to leave others unsettled. That strange reserve would soon find more concrete outlets, where actions replaced impressions and where witnesses could no longer dismiss their unease as a trick of grief or reserve. It was then that the first incidents began to surface, incidents that hinted at darker patterns taking root. The first signs missed. The first troubles linked to Timothy did not center on people, but on the animals that surrounded daily farm life. In rural Missouri, livestock loss was so common it rarely drew suspicion. Whether illness and predators stole animals from families every season, and neighbors often swapped stories of similar misfortunes. Against this backdrop, the early deaths near the Caldwell property were folded into the same category of chance. Calves were found stiff in their pens, chickens scattered lifeless across hard earth, and dogs that once guarded barns turned up suddenly dead. One incident could be dismissed, even two, but when more followed, the community reached for familiar explanations and settled there. It was difficult for anyone to imagine that such losses might share a closer source. The animals left behind gave their own responses, though few chose to interpret them as evidence. Horses shifted uneasily in their stalls whenever Timothy entered, nostrils flared and hooves pounding until he stepped away. Dogs that ordinarily shadowed family members instead circled clear of him, some growling low, others slinking out of reach. Chickens erupted in nervous flurries when he came near with feed, scattering as if the food itself was irrelevant. Neighbors noted these reactions in passing but reasoned them away. Perhaps he startled the animals with his quiet approach, or perhaps working soil clung to him in ways they disliked. With other burdens pressing harder, most people did not linger on what united these scattered signs. What stood out more clearly were Timothy's expressions, or lack of them, during moments when animals were discovered dead. His uncle might curse at the waist of a calf, and women at nearby farms whispered prayers when hens were strewn before them. But Timothy met such scenes with a calm that seemed almost studied. Testimony preserved later by Dr. Harding described how the boy positioned himself close enough to examine carcasses, speaking in flat tones about details that others avoided. He remarked on the speed with which a body stiffened or on how feathers bent unnaturally when pulled. These were the observations of someone watching a process, not mourning a loss. Adults, seeking comfort, explained this away by insisting Timothy had grown accustomed to hardship. They did not ask why a child would choose to dwell on the mechanical features of death rather than on its emotional weight. The pattern of avoidance from animals continued with a regularity more difficult to explain. A tethered watchdog lunged and snapped whenever Timothy neared its radius, as though his very presence was intolerable. Horses rolled their eyes back, ears pinned flat at the sight of him. Even among livestock used to routine handling, the same unease repeated whenever he drew close. These reactions were too consistent to go unnoticed, yet still people chose ordinary answers. Animals could be temperamental, anyone could be unlucky enough to trigger their nerves. It was easier to accept these explanations than to suspect deliberate harm in their midst. The spread of deaths to neighboring farms did little to sharpen perspective. One family described finding a cluster of goats dead in their pen, each body unmarked and still. Another believed disease had swept suddenly through their pigs, though no sickened animals lingered after. Such losses were shared in fragments, lamented over fences, mentioned at Sunday gatherings, but no one assembled them into a pattern. There was comfort in simply blaming predators or poor feed, even if those causes did not fit neatly. Linking the incidents together would have meant confronting possibilities no one wished to voice. What later became most telling was the form the losses took. Many of the carcasses bore marks inconsistent with wild animals or sickness. Predators leave bite wounds, carry prey off, or leave carnage scattered. Disease lingers and weakens, showing infection or rot. Instead, some of these deaths displayed sudden precision, twisted necks, neat trauma, or no external injury at all. The signs pointed to deliberate action, though nothing at the time moved the community to entertain that thought. Without a medicinal or psychological framework for cruelty, they returned to explanations that allowed them to preserve order in their lives. Modern forensic literature treats repeated, intentional cruelty to animals as one of the clearest early warning markers for later aggressive violence in children. What neighbors dismissed as chance or accident, current psychologists would note as a pattern requiring urgent attention. Research consistently maintains that animal cruelty does not occur in isolation, but signals deeper issues tied to empathy, impulse control, and aggression. Timothy's calm presence among the dead, and the sheer regularity of those losses around him, fit into this category with uncomfortable precision. His era, however, offered none of these interpretive tools. To 19th century farmers, daily misfortune was almost naturalized. Another storm, another failed crop, another animal gone. This constant exposure bred an ability to fold each new trouble into the background. A boy's odd silence seemed less suspicious when everyone lived beside unrelenting grief and labor. Even the avoidance shown by animals remained unexamined, because people assumed they had more practical worries than puzzling over temperament. The pattern was clear enough to modern readers, but blurred into ordinary noise for a weary community. In this way, vital early signs passed unrecognized. Instead of raising questions, the livestock deaths became another burden absorbed without investigation. Timothy's detached observations were seen as stoicism, his unsettling presence around farm animals dismissed as chance. Opportunities to intervene slipped by, and the first clear evidence of danger remained hidden in plain sight. This failure to recognize warning signs created the conditions for what came next. Once the deaths involved more than livestock, explanations of accident or misfortune proved harder to maintain, yet many still tried. What the community accepted as background risk would soon return in more human and far more unsettling form. Accidents that didn't add up. The first death involving people happened quietly, framed as nothing more than misfortune. A neighbor's son, a boy who was older than Timothy and well accustomed to the waterways near his family's farm, was found drowned in a creek that cut shallow through the fields. The current was strong that spring, and locals explained it away as chance. Still, Timothy was there. He watched the search and directed neighbors to the exact bend where they retrieved the body. His description of the boy slipping into the current was delivered with unusual clarity, repeating details as though memorized. To adults, this seemed like strong recollection. To others who remembered later, the detachment in his account lingered with unease, his voice calm while families wept beside him. Only weeks passed before another life was lost. This time it was a farmhand from a neighboring property, killed when a barn loft gave way beneath his weight. Such accidents were common in a place where wood aged faster than men could repair it, but Timothy had again been nearby, watching. He demonstrated to onlookers exactly how the timber had twisted before snapping, how the man's body pitched forward when it struck the ground. One witness recalled how Timothy stooped to mimic the position of the fall, lowering himself slowly as if recreating the moment. Adults rationalized this as childish curiosity, but the impression afterward was less of a boy disturbed by violence than of an observer intent on preserving its mechanics. The third incident involved his younger cousin, discovered dead beside the family's shed with his head split against farming equipment. Neighbors interpreted the scene as rough play gone wrong, the kind of tragedy that struck children everywhere. Yet Timothy was close at hand again, explaining quietly to his Aunt Sarah that the boy had tripped at just the wrong angle. She remembered the detail in his voice more than the words themselves, the sound of impact, the precise placement of the fall. His delivery, calm and unbroken, left her chilled even in the summer heat. To others, Timothy's orderly explanation was offered as reassurance. Few paused to question the oddity of a child recounting death with a tone stripped of feeling. What bound these events together was not only Timothy's presence but his behavior in the aftermath. Where children typically recoiled or clung fearfully to parents, he stepped forward. Relatives spoke of his stillness among wailing families, his composure beside coffins or broken bodies. He leaned close to study what others could not bear to see: the tilt of a shattered limb, the paleness creeping across skin. His calm seemed at first a strength that people could misinterpret as resilience. His community, already hardened by war and loss, viewed those qualities as admirable. Only after time passed did his interest appear more like a fixation. Each accident alone seemed plausible. Pooled together, they formed an unsettling cluster: a drowned boy, a crushed farmhand, a cousin lost to a simple fall, all deaths unfolding in Timothy's orbit. That pattern was not recognized. Neighbors believed themselves unlucky, a season marked by grief, nothing more. But in investigative practice today, repeated involvement in such accidents, especially when tied to one child's constant presence, is seen differently. Investigators now treat repeated involvement in accidental deaths, especially the same child's repeated presence, as a pattern that requires prompt inquiry. 1 accident can be chance, 2 demand scrutiny, and 3 suggest a non-accidental pattern. The framework for noticing such connections did not exist in Missouri during the 1860s, and families continued to interpret Timothy's presence as coincidence. Later, Dr. Samuel Harding would refer back to this period in his notes. He recorded how Timothy displayed the unusual ability to reconstruct accidents in exact detail. The boy reenacted impacts using his own body, arranged objects to mimic the angle of falls, and cataloged the stiffness of livestock after death. To Harding, these recollections went far beyond what most adults could retrieve under stress. He noted Timothy seemed compelled to preserve the event as a series of movements, disengaged from emotion. Yet, as Harding himself conceded, the alienist vocabulary of his time left him unable to define what he observed. 19th century alienism lacked the categories later codified in the DSM-5, so he could describe Timothy's detachment but not classify it further. For families of the time, survival needs shaped how they rationalized each death. People accustomed to war and debt clung to explanations that kept order intact: a strong spring current, an aging barn beam, careless play. Admitting another possibility invited disruption far greater than they could bear. They interpreted Timothy's composure as stoicism. They admired his observational skills as attentiveness. What they could not confront was the prospect of intent lurking where they expected childhood innocence. Instead of linking the accidents, they compartmentalized them as unrelated losses. Memory preserved each death but not the emerging sequence that connected them. The accumulation of incidents, however, highlights a shift modern professionals recognize clearly: an escalation from animal deaths to human ones, each accompanied by Timothy's cold precision in recounting what occurred. His behavior fits the pattern of someone not simply witnessing but studying the mechanics of injury and death. Where others recoiled, he cataloged. Where others averted their eyes, he recreated. The community absorbed his detachment into their understanding of hardship, rationalizing composure as a virtue. For modern investigators, the same qualities would raise urgent questions about motive and intent. The written traces from those years reveal more about the adults than about Timothy himself. They reveal how fragile interpretation can be when framed by grief, how people adjust stories around them to preserve what feels survivable. Accidents that clustered around one child's presence were treated as bad luck, while his peculiar calmness was reshaped into strength. Those choices insulated families from suspicion but also shielded Timothy from scrutiny. In hindsight, the details resist such easy readings. Each victim, each calm recital of their final moments, pointed toward a consistent pattern that was never named as such. The gaps between what was observed and what was understood set the stage for how Timothy would be remembered. Neighbors saw composure. Harding noted demonstrations shaped by a mind coldly curious. What none possessed were the tools to make sense of those contradictions. The accidents sat in community memory as puzzles without solutions, shadows that resisted explanation. They marked the boundary where recorded observation outpaced interpretation, a boundary that would continue to narrow as more accounts survived. Those scattered testimonies, and Harding's efforts to place them in his journals, show how much could be noticed without being named. They also lay the foundation for understanding how Timothy's behavior resonated far outside the limits of his own time. Psychology then versus now. When Dr. Samuel Harding opened his journals in 1867, he was reaching for language that did not yet exist. He described Timothy Caldwell as an outwardly ordinary child who revealed what Harding called cold demonstrations of curiosity at scenes of injury and death. He wrote of Timothy's composure while others wept, his flat recounting of tragic events, and his willingness to linger beside blood and corpses when most boys recoiled. These entries reflected Harding's care as an observer, but they also show the limits of medical vocabulary in his time. Psychiatry as we understand it had not yet formed. Harding circled descriptions of temperament, moral character, and strangeness, but his words revealed bafflement more than clarity. He was a doctor with no framework, trying to record something that resisted categorization. From a contemporary perspective, Harding's careful notes map onto features modern psychiatry now recognizes. The DSM-5 defines conduct disorder as a repeated, persistent violation of the rights of others and the rules of society. The criteria include aggression toward people and animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness or theft, and serious rule breaking. Harding's records point directly toward some of these categories. Timothy was consistently linked with unexplained animal deaths, alongside the unnerving calmness he displayed when human lives were lost. Harding described a boy who could describe violent incidents in sequence without signs of fear or grief, echoing what modern clinicians would identify as a lack of remorse. Even Timothy's practiced politeness and orderly behavior in structured settings resemble the deceptive social mask that conduct-disordered children sometimes employ to deflect suspicion. Harding did not have these terms, but his observations form an early outline of what psychiatry more than a century later would define with clinical criteria. The DSM-5, updated in 2013, also introduced a specific edition for children like Timothy, a limited prosocial emotions specifier. This subtype describes youth showing traits of callousness, shallow affect, lack of remorse, or indifference to performance. Clinical research associates these children with a higher risk of developing severe and persistent antisocial behavior in adolescence and adulthood. In one set of field trial estimates, about 5% of children in psychiatric samples met the criteria for this specifier, highlighting its relative rarity but its significant weight in predicting risk. Harding's descriptions of Timothy's unchanging countenance and his detachment from grief mark him as a clear candidate for what today would fall under this category. To Harding, he was simply untouched by human affections. To a modern psychiatrist, those traits mark one of the highest-risk child profiles recognized in clinical data. Yet to Harding's contemporaries, a phrase like limited prosocial emotions was unimaginable. The dominant framework in the mid-19th century was alienism, a fledgling branch of medicine concerned with mental abnormality. Alienists debated whether madness came from spiritual corruption, anatomical lesions, or moral decay within families. Their classification systems focused almost entirely on adults, and the few terms applied to children, such as moral insanity, were broad, vague, and without a scientific base. In that world, Timothy's combination of cold observation and suspicious accidents defied containment. Harding's notes oscillated between medical and moral language, but he had no means to define a child who seemed orderly yet brought death close behind him. His community, too, had few tools beyond prayer or gossip. The child they encountered could not be processed through the fragile categories of the day. The cultural climate reinforced this blindness. Postwar Missouri admired qualities like stillness, discipline, and stoicism. Timothy appeared to embody those virtues, and his obedience made him a model child in a time when neighbors sought resilience more than laughter. Where a modern clinician would see detached affect, his contemporaries saw composure. Where current psychiatry would view repeated cruelty to animals as diagnostic, the Caldwell family and their neighbors saw misfortune and bad luck. Timothy's environment rewarded his performance of self-control and misread it as strength, leaving no space for suspicion. Harding sensed something dissonant, yet in practice he was limited to faithful descriptions in his journal. His field had not yet reached the capacity to attach meaning to what he was seeing. Today, research emphasizes why recognition matters. A child displaying repetitive aggression, emotional flatness, and concealed cruelty is not simply unusual, it is a red flag cluster indicating the need for intervention. Modern child psychiatry emphasizes therapy designed to cultivate emotional recognition, empathy, and moral reflection. Early identification is the difference between redirection and escalation. Timothy's case illustrates what happens in the absence of such recognition. His behavior continued uninterrupted because there was no suspicion attached to it, no diagnostic system to name it, and no treatment programs designed for children like him. The results accumulated quietly, leaving patterns of tragedy that neighbors accepted as chance. One detail Harding noted with precision was Timothy's stone-like expression in the presence of loss. Others remarked on his matter-of-fact speech, devoid of sentiment, as he described how bodies shifted, how injury looked, how stiffening occurred post-mortem. In today's terminology, such traits overlap with callous unemotional dimensions used to predict long-term violence risk. Modern clinicians would register these features as alarming. But the caution from forensic and legal professionals is also worth emphasizing. Diagnostic language requires careful, developmentally sensitive evaluation. Children's emotional flatness cannot be equated automatically with a forensic verdict. Some may be withdrawn by temperament or shaped by trauma. A responsible evaluation involves context, corroborating behavior, and long-term observation. Labels like conduct disorder or callous unemotional traits carry weight, but they must be applied with clinical precision, not assumption. Had Timothy grown up in the present, his trajectory through medical and social systems would likely have been starkly different. Within clinical settings today, repeated animal cruelty alone would trigger an evaluation. Documentation of his detachment during human accidents would elevate concern, leading quickly to referrals for specialized assessment. The DSM-5 framework would likely classify him as meeting criteria for conduct disorder with the limited prosocial emotions specifier. From there, intervention strategies would be shaped around therapy aimed at building emotional responsiveness, structured community supervision, and school-based monitoring. Families would receive education and structured plans to redirect dangerous behavior. In this system, Timothy would not simply pass through unnoticed. His conduct would demand explanation, and supervision would attempt to contain it before escalation. In contrast, the treatments imagined by Harding's contemporaries were dominated by moral exhortation. A child who lied might be disciplined harshly, a boy indifferent to prayer told to pray longer, and a display of coldness interpreted as sin rather than symptom. Timothy's obedience, his willingness to carry out chores, to attend school lessons without resistance, and to hold his silence in church marked those lessons as working. In reality, they allowed his behavior to persist beneath notice. No professional framework existed to push further, no structured therapy waited to intervene. By the time his patterns could no longer be dismissed, the deaths had already marked his record. This delay represents the deep gulf between Harding's observations and modern psychiatry's responses. That gulf underscores a broader truth. The traits were visible, but their interpretation belonged to the era. Timothy was not invisible. Harding's notes detail his composure with care, neighbors remembered his presence at deaths, and animals recoiled in ways that were hard to ignore. But in 1867 Missouri, those fragments never assembled into a profile. Where modern clinicians would cite diagnostic clusters, treatment pathways, and long-term monitoring, Harding had only perplexity and community silence. The result was an enduring gap between observation and meaning, a gap into which Timothy comfortably disappeared. These differences between psychology then and now frame an unsettling continuity. The behaviors Harding observed are cataloged today with clinical precision, their outcomes mapped in data and risk estimates. What was once baffling is now charted in systems of diagnostic categories. The tragedy lies in the timing. Timothy lived in an age that had no vocabulary, no scaffold for prevention, no tools to act. The contrast brings the story to its next dimension, not only the categories of diagnosis, but the hard numbers that measure risk, prevalence, and outcomes in populations where such traits appear. It is in those numbers that the scale of Timothy's resemblance to later cases fully emerges. Numbers behind the darkness. By 2025, the study of juvenile violence has advanced into a discipline of measurable precision, shaped by psychiatry, neuroscience, and long-term data analysis. Behaviors that once baffled observers like Dr. Harding can now be quantified, correlated, and placed within recognized risk models. Patterns such as a child's persistent cruelty, affectless demeanor, or repeated presence at accidental deaths can be tracked not as mysteries, but as statistically supported red flags. This research does not erase historical uncertainty, but it allows us to situate past cases inside a framework that shows how certain behaviors reliably predict future violence when left unchecked. To frame Timothy Caldwell's story against modern data, it is important to look at what the DSM-5 field trials found when these categories were tested in clinical samples. In child psychiatric outpatient populations, estimates of conduct disorder fell within the single-digit % range. In some field trial reports, prevalence was recorded around 8%. A smaller subset of these children also met the limited prosocial emotions specifier, what clinicians describe as the subset showing callous, unemotional traits such as lack of remorse, shallow affect, and minimal empathy. Field trial estimates placed this group at around 5% within those clinical samples, highlighting their clinical importance even though they represent a tighter subgroup. These figures represent observed rates in treatment settings, not worldwide prevalence, but they underscore how children with profiles echoing Timothy's remain identifiable and documented today. Among those warning signs, animal cruelty has stood out with particular consistency. Modern forensic and psychiatric literature treats repeated, intentional harm to animals as one of the clearest early indicators of risk. The distinction between childish mischief and significant pathology lies in repetition and intent. Isolated acts of carelessness are common, but consistent patterns of deliberate cruelty, combined with indifference to pain or death, signal the kind of escalating trajectory linked to later aggression. This recognition has shifted how investigators, clinicians, and social workers interpret such behaviors. In Timothy's century, livestock deaths were misunderstood as natural misfortune. Today they would be cataloged as a sequence of risk markers. Each unexplained carcass would contribute to accumulating evidence of underlying conduct disorder with significant forensic weight. Longitudinal research reinforces the urgency behind such interpretations. Studies following children across decades show strong and recurring correlations. Those who engage in repeated animal cruelty under the age of 10 appear disproportionately in criminal records as adults. Though the strength of the correlation varies across samples, the direction is consistent. Early cruelty to animals markedly increases the likelihood of later human-directed aggression. Forensic cohorts, juvenile justice records, and psychiatric follow-ups all carry the same signal. That weight of data explains why modern psychologists treat such cruelty as a red flag requiring intervention rather than a phase to be outgrown. Timothy, situated in this model, would not be read as unusually calm or oddly self-possessed. He would be noted immediately as a child on a trajectory that demanded active monitoring. More recent work has introduced immense sample sizes to sharpen these insights further. In 2025, researchers such as Sway and colleagues published analyses of around 18,470 adolescents, using multifactorial models to test predictors of antisocial outcomes. While factors such as parental expectations and even smoking behavior emerged as influential, the findings reinforced that no single behavior exists in isolation. Risk rises when multiple indicators cluster. Cruelty, lack of remorse, and emotional flatness compound one another. These massive datasets highlight why children like Timothy cannot be understood through anecdotes alone. Each feature he displayed, when layered together, would now be charted as part of a profile consistent with elevated long-term risk. Numbers also help redefine how one child's case connects to larger contexts. In the 19th century, Timothy was seen in isolation, an odd boy in one county troubling in ways that seemed unique. Statistics shift that perspective. When clinicians record single-digit percentages of outpatient children meeting conduct disorder criteria, and a smaller but significant slice showing callous, unemotional features, it reframes Timothy not as anomaly but as exemplar of a recognized category. In clinical data, children like him exist across populations, flagged for their high rate of progression toward later aggression. This realization is perhaps the most unsettling. The historical case lines up not with an unknowable mystery, but with traits measurable in data from tens of thousands of modern children. At the same time, treating these numbers with precision matters. They are not global population averages but clinical field trial observations. Translating them carelessly risks exaggeration. The point is not to claim that 5% of all children mirror Timothy, but that careful studies within treatment settings consistently identify a minority subgroup whose features align closely with the patterns he displayed. Within that subgroup, risk for escalation rises enough that current practitioners treat early intervention as urgent. This balance, avoiding overstatement while acknowledging predictive strength, is how modern science contextualizes historical cases responsibly. Timothy's behavior would therefore not puzzle a 21st century investigator in the ways it baffled Harding. His cruelty toward animals would sit directly within red flag guidelines. His lack of affect in the presence of tragedy would match the callous, unemotional specifier. His fixation on accident details would reinforce suspicions of a child studying harm rather than mourning loss. Each feature would be entered into a checklist and evaluated not as an isolated peculiarity, but as a cluster consistent with heightened risk. Data transforms the interpretive gap that once left him unnamed and unclassifiable. The sharpness of that lens allows for intervention strategies his community could not imagine. With cases identified early, modern psychiatry pairs family education, structured therapy, and school-based monitoring to redirect risk trajectories. The field acknowledges that not all children displaying such features inevitably escalate, but the clustering of multiple markers demands attention. Timothy exemplifies why. His escalation from animals to human accidents is the very path described in current models, illustrating the danger of treating such behaviors as coincidence. What the statistics ultimately contribute is scale. They show that Timothy was not a unique figure swallowed by the peculiarities of 1867 Missouri. Rather, he sits inside a measurable continuum, one recognized across cultures and decades. This continuum carries not only diagnostic names but predictive weights, estimates, and risk profiles. It is that transformation, from baffling individual case into documented risk category, that underscores how modern forensic psychology views children like Timothy. Yet numbers, no matter how precise, can only go so far. They provide probabilities, not the details of lived behavior. They map patterns but stop short of describing how those patterns take form in a specific life. To understand that dimension requires shifting from statistical models back to the tangible traces a child left behind, the physical evidence, the private spaces, the unsettling artifacts that show how his thoughts took shape away from others. It is in that material world, not only in numbers, that the clearest insight into Timothy Caldwell's mind begins to emerge. The forensic lens. When modern investigators revisit the Caldwell case, one of the most striking details they focus on is the secluded hideaway Timothy carved out for himself among the limestone bluffs at the edge of the farm. Accounts describe a shallow cave, easy to overlook but private enough to become his own secret shelter. Inside, people later reported finding crude drawings etched onto the stone, along with sketchbooks, sharpened tools, and handwritten notes scattered across the floor. To his caretakers, these discoveries seemed unremarkable at the time, just the imaginative creations of a lonely boy without siblings. A hideout filled with sketches might have passed as innocent play for any child. Yet through the eyes of forensic psychology today, that space becomes something far less benign. An archive of preoccupation, a place where Timothy rehearsed what lived too deeply inside him to express openly. Drawings left behind by children in similar contexts are now treated with considerable seriousness. Forensic assessments examine them for repetition, consistency of themes, and emphasis on violence or control. Timothy's cave was said to contain repeated images of livestock depicted in states of injury, simple human forms sketched with careful detail around joints and posture, and crude diagrams of tools emphasized with unusual precision. Unlike normal childhood artwork, which often radiates energy, play, or adventure, these sketches concentrated on stillness, damage, and mechanics. To a trained eye, that focus would suggest rehearsal more than imagination. Modern evaluators document and catalog such drawings as significant artifacts because they help to reveal the preoccupations a child may otherwise conceal. The hidden collection of tools added another layer. On Missouri farms in 1867, it was normal for children to carry small knives for chores, and work implements lined every barn. What set Timothy apart was not possession but secrecy. Witnesses recalled items such as knives sharpened down to unnerving points, hooks filed to fine edges, and smaller blades kept out of family sight. These were not tools placed on a workbench or used in ordinary chores. They were concealed in the cave alongside his drawings. The secrecy matters. Forensic investigators today read concealed implements not as harmless curiosity but as preparation. When paired with violent imagery, they signal more than fascination. They suggest a child testing and rehearsing ways to act upon the ideas represented in sketches. Concealment transforms ordinary tools into indicators of planning. In forensic psychology, physical artifacts like drawings, hidden notes, or sharpened objects are charted alongside documented behavior to construct a fuller profile. Timothy's cave, viewed in this light, represents three distinct but interlocking strands: repeated violent images, concealed weapons, and a private space where both were assembled away from adult supervision. Each element alone might not raise alarms. Together, they converge into a clear profile of rehearsal and escalation. The artifacts reveal not just interest but systematized preoccupation. A mind moving steadily from observing injury toward considering its deliberate creation. What makes Timothy's cave haunting is how closely its contents align with modern profiles of high-risk juveniles. Case files built over the past several decades show a repeated arc: fascination with injured animals, production of violent drawings, concealed collections of weapons, and then eventual involvement in death staged as accidents. Each development brings greater proximity to direct violence. If Timothy were assessed under current frameworks, the cave would not be dismissed as childish eccentricity. Instead, it would be classified as a high-priority warning sign and cross-referenced with his history of animal cruelty, his unsettling responses to local deaths, and his blank affect in moments of grief. Professionals today would organize the cave's elements into categories during risk assessment: the artwork indicating obsession, the sharpened tools showing preparation, and the secrecy of the space itself suggesting intentional concealment. Together, these would be interpreted as converging evidence of escalation. In this framework, Timothy was not only rehearsing in drawings, but also assembling physical means to transform those rehearsals into real acts. His community, however, never drew these connections. They considered caves and hideouts a part of childhood, tools a fact of rural life, and drawings a harmless output of boredom. Those interpretations concealed what, in hindsight, was developing clearly in front of them. The forensic parallels do not stop with Timothy. Contemporary investigations into violent juveniles repeatedly uncover hidden notebooks, secret caches of knives, or coded imagery that fixates on control and death. These artifacts are systematically documented in juvenile risk assessments and treated as significant because they demonstrate planning concealed from adults, a pattern linked with more serious later behavior. The discovery of Timothy's cave fits into this pattern almost exactly. What once seemed like a childish diversion now aligns with a set of behaviors recognized across modern forensic records. It is important, however, to remain cautious with classification. Contemporary clinicians avoid labeling very young children as psychopathic. In line with DSM-5 guidance, they instead use the diagnosis of conduct disorder, and when traits of callousness, shallow affect, and lack of remorse are present, they add the limited prosocial emotions specifier. This framework allows professionals to describe concerning patterns without applying a term like psychopathy, which is highly contested in child populations. Risk assessments stress that such profiles must be built across repeated evaluations and supported by longitudinal observation, since children can present apparently cold or unusual behavior for many reasons, including trauma. That caution moderates interpretation, while recognizing that what Timothy exhibited fell into traits strongly associated with elevated risk. Even with those caveats, the forensic reading of Timothy's hideaway remains unsettling. His drawings offer a window into the thought processes behind his calm presence at accidents. His hidden blades suggest preparation rather than impulse, and his secrecy demonstrates the building of a private inner world disconnected from the persona he showed his family and neighbors. In modern terms, these behaviors represent a convergence of obsession, concealment, and preparation, the hallmarks of an emerging profile categorized as conduct disorder with limited prosocial emotions. Early, structured intervention would be considered mandatory if such evidence were uncovered today. The secrecy of the cave also holds meaning in terms of identity. Modern profiles emphasize the split between public persona and private reality. Juveniles flagged as high risk often display obedience, politeness, and restraint in public, while privately cultivating ideas and preparations starkly at odds with that mask. Timothy embodied this contrast. Neighbors praised him for his discipline and quiet demeanor, unaware of the sharpened implements and careful drawings hidden a few hundred yards from the farmhouse. His cave was, in effect, the private workshop where his preoccupation expanded freely without oversight. Forensic teams would describe this as an environment enabling escalation. An additional point for modern evaluators is the distinction between impulsive aggression and calculated aggression. Impulsive behavior can sometimes be redirected through therapy and structure. Calculated aggression, however, signals rehearsal and planning, traits that are weaker to intervention. Timothy's cave suggested strongly the latter, cataloging, recording, and preparing quietly rather than reacting chaotically in the moment. This difference matters in determining treatment and long-term prognosis. A child absorbed in secret planning illustrates a structured framework of thinking, rather than a passing phase of mischief. Had forensic investigators today walked into that cave, their conclusion would be formal and precise. They would treat the drawings as evidence of violent fixation, the sharpened tools as preparation toward action, and the secrecy of the space as concealment. As a cluster, these artifacts would mark Timothy as a high-risk profile requiring close and immediate monitoring. His case would be flagged for structured intervention, with recognition that unchecked progression often leads to escalation. To his community, it was only the play of a boy. To forensic science, it would be undeniable evidence of a child rehearsing control and cruelty in private. Where his contemporaries saw a makeshift playhouse, modern evaluation reclassifies it as a workshop of intent. Every chalk etching and sharpened hook becomes a trace of a developing pattern. And while 19th century observers lacked the tools to name what they found, today's forensic lens recognizes those fragments as the markers of a dangerous progression. The artifacts left in that limestone cave set the stage for what professionals would encounter when Timothy eventually came under formal confinement. The hidden drawings and concealed tools gave way to coded notes and demonstrations in settings that forced closer observation. What began as secrecy near a farm bluff evolved into behavior scrutinized under institutional supervision, as Timothy carried his need for concealment and calculation with him into the hospital walls. The cage and the escape. Timothy Caldwell's entry into the Missouri State Hospital was marked by quiet observation rather than spectacle. Unlike the men who filled its wards with shouting or delusion, he arrived without protest, and his small figure stood out in corridors built to contain troubled adults. At just 9 years old, he represented something the institution had not anticipated, a child whose file listed unease instead of certainty. The officials who admitted him could not agree if he belonged in their care for madness, malice, or simple misfortune. The hospital had been designed to restrain violent or disordered adults, not to contain a boy who stirred suspicion but showed no disorder of mind they could define. His presence was an unfamiliar problem for staff accustomed to obvious madness. From the beginning, he unsettled those who tried to monitor him. Attendants expected resistance or breakdowns. Instead, they encountered a patient who seemed unusually calm. He answered questions about dead livestock and accidents back home without denial, yet without emotion. He described the events as if he were citing dates or weather, never coloring his story with grief or guilt. To some staff, this composure suggested stability or even cooperation. Others noted its strangeness. The politeness was real enough, but behind it lay something unyielding, an absence that none could easily name. Life inside the institution revealed these impressions more clearly. Timothy adapted quickly to the hospital's routines. He accepted food, carried out assigned tasks, and conducted himself with an orderliness unlike many around him. He rarely spoke, but when he did, he chose his words with care. That efficiency encouraged trust from attendants. He was easy to manage compared with the adults who fought, shouted, or dissolved into incoherence. Yet the doctors watching him more closely suspected another possibility. Was the boy adjusting or learning? Some began to note that his stillness had the quality of surveillance. His eyes followed routines, lingered on keys at belts, studied when doors were opened and shut. The strongest evidence that Timothy was not merely passing time appeared in what was later discovered among his belongings. During his confinement, staff recorded the discovery of a coded journal in his quarters, pages filled with odd symbols, letter reversals, and cryptic annotations. At first, the writing seemed like private nonsense, but under the review of Dr. Fitzgerald, himself attempting therapeutic experiments with patient writings, the entries revealed themselves as structured notes. They cataloged the responses of staff, recorded phrases to use or avoid, and even listed strategies for when to display sorrow. What seemed childlike scrawling at first carried deliberate intent. In that journal, Timothy rehearsed deception. He wrote reminders that apology softened suspicion, that brief silence could suggest humility, and that tears, real or not, won trust. He appeared to understand that sincerity could be mimicked if one studied carefully. Each observation was written as if for practice, a private manual coaching himself on when to bow the head or when to meet an eye. His recognition that control came through performance, not force, struck later readers as extraordinary in so young a child. It also explained why staff began to think they saw progress. Alienist medicine in Missouri in the 1860s lacked any framework for such behavior. When Timothy spoke apologies or appeared contrite, attendants believed treatment was working. When he softened his manner or lowered his gaze, they thought humility was taking root. In truth, he may have been following the rehearsals written in his journal, refining them until they appeared spontaneous. His apparent breakthroughs could have been performances perfected by practice, not real transformation. For doctors and attendants who longed to see improvement, the difference was nearly impossible to detect. The forensic significance of that journal is clear today. Modern psychology recognizes callous unemotional traits in some children precisely through their ability to manufacture displays of emotion. Research shows they learn not empathy itself but the outward signals of empathy, and they deploy these signals strategically. Timothy's entries provide a rare written record of the process, a child training himself in the manipulation of perception. Forensic evaluators now would treat such evidence not as eccentric scribbling but as material proof of high-risk traits. It would be cataloged in his file, and security procedures would intensify immediately. In current practice, a child who demonstrates a capacity to script false emotion would be managed with strict protocols. Limited solo contact with staff, monitored interactions, and locked routines against manipulation. In Timothy's time, no such procedures existed. His caretakers rewarded the very traits that confirmed his strategy. Each polite act, each show of contrition earned him more leniency instead of increased caution. He was allowed to join lighter tasks, to walk under less direct supervision, to appear increasingly harmless. The coded journal revealed later that these results were not accidental but the outcome of careful rehearsal. By acting safe, Timothy convinced those around him to treat him as safe, until the boundaries of his confinement loosened. The circumstances of Timothy's eventual disappearance from the hospital are thin in records. No dramatic break-in or chaotic riot is described. Instead, his absence is noted abruptly, without much detail of the moment itself. The most likely explanation is not force or chance but patience. He waited until he had built enough trust for a lapse in watchfulness to occur, then used that moment. His escape appears less like a burst of desperation than the culmination of cultivated perception. He had taught his keepers to see him as docile, and when they finally relaxed their vigilance, opportunity opened. To modern eyes, the story is not one of oversight but of structured manipulation. The cave with drawings and sharpened tools had been a rehearsal of imagery and preparation. The coded hospital journal was a rehearsal of performance and control. Both reflected a mind that cataloged methods and refined them until effective. Each false smile or modest silence within the hospital corridors must be considered within this framework. Not spontaneous but practiced, part of a deliberate pattern aimed at release. If such a case occurred now, discovery of his coded writing would tighten every layer of contact. Staff would be briefed on the high likelihood of manipulation. Apologies and tears would be recognized as tactics, not progress. Immediate reassessment of risk classification would follow, and any thought of reducing surveillance would be dismissed. Timothy, however, lived in a time when alienists had only the language of moral improvement. They treated outward change as inward change, and that error gave him the margin he required. The escape remains less a mystery of when or how than a demonstration of what unchecked manipulation can achieve. Years later, when the coded notes were examined by Fitzgerald and other physicians, the extent of his practice came into focus. By then, the boy himself was gone, and the hospital could only record his absence. The Missouri State Hospital held Timothy Caldwell for a short span, yet during that time he demonstrated the sharpened skill of shaping adult perception. Those journals stand as witnesses, not of insanity but of calculation carried out with a child's hand. He did not simply leave confinement, he constructed his own permission to step through its boundaries. From that moment onward, Timothy's trail moved beyond the walls of any single institution. His absence became a vacuum filled with speculation. Neighbors remembered, rumors spread, and scattered reports began to surface of incidents that bore uncanny resemblance to what Missouri had already witnessed. Whether he matured into greater danger or vanished into obscurity remained unknown. But what followed in memory and record suggested his story did not end at the gates of the hospital. The Statistical Ghost. When Timothy Caldwell passed beyond the walls of the Missouri State Hospital, what followed left not a continuous trail but fragments scattered in records and recollections. Instead of a single narrative, there emerged only pieces: ledger entries, coroner's notes, and the occasional whisper written down in parish books. Each account standing on its own seemed trivial or ambiguous. A drowned child here, a barn fire there, a vanished animal somewhere else. But when archivists later began compiling those scattered pieces into digital databases and re-examining them against one another, something more distinct appeared. A faint but consistent outline, the impression of a figure lingering just beyond full visibility. This is what modern historians and forensic analysts describe as Timothy's statistical ghost. Reports from the decades after his disappearance show unsettling similarity to events that had defined his childhood. In several towns across the Midwest, coroners documented the inexplicable loss of livestock, injuries that bore no signs of predators, and fires whose spread appeared deliberate rather than accidental. Some accounts include children discovered lifeless near water or farm equipment, their deaths recorded as ordinary misadventure. In a few cases, there were even quiet descriptions of a stranger who drifted through a community, a youth or young man marked by his composure, who departed soon after some local tragedy. Each record on its own remained entirely explainable, but their collective pattern aligned closely with the cruelties already tied to Timothy's early life. One local report from Nebraska describes a boy of abnormal stillness questioned after a stable collapse killed animals and a farmhand. No charges followed, and the boy's name went unpreserved, but the description recalls details once used to portray Timothy as a child: detachment behind the eyes, politeness without warmth. An Iowa parish record from the 1880s, preserved in its margins, noted whispers of a youth who appeared in town weeks before a rash of unexplained fires and left abruptly once suspicion surfaced. None of these mentions prove identity. They do, however, share a rhythm of circumstance familiar to anyone who has handled Timothy's case: deaths that could be shrugged away as chance, yet always shadowed by the appearance of a boy or young man who stood apart. The chilling implication is less about establishing Timothy's presence in any single event than about understanding the broader pattern. Modern psychology frames childhood cruelty not as an endpoint, but as the beginning of a progression if left unaddressed. Children who start by experimenting on animals often escalate, expanding both their method and scope as they age. In Timothy's case, that evolution is suggested in the way incidents became increasingly deliberate over time. What began in Missouri as curious observation of accidents matured, in scattered reports, into deaths and fires staged with unsettling precision. His development, glimpsed in fragments, mirrors the arc charted in contemporary forensic literature. A childhood marked by cruelty and absence of remorse followed by an adulthood capable of greater, more calculated harm. Communities of the 19th century were ill-equipped to recognize connection across distance. Without centralized reporting systems or shared archival databases, each coroner and sheriff worked in isolation. A drowning in one county seemed unlinked to a collapse 2 states away. Without mechanisms to align the pieces, suspicions dissolved as quickly as they formed. What we now see as pattern then appeared as misfortunes scattered irregularly across counties. Only much later, with the arrival of digital aggregation of historical documents, could these faint echoes be set side by side. It was through that method, not through folklore or rumor, that Timothy's outline reappeared. What individuals experienced as singular losses coalesced into repeating features visible only in the wide statistical frame. By the early 21st century, researchers began applying analytical models to these historical archives, feeding coroner's reports, rural newspapers, and parish records into searchable databases. Within these massive collections, the unfamiliar became recognizable. Cases once thought to be random clustered when cross-referenced by details. Unexplained livestock deaths, children lost near water despite familiarity with it, barns collapsed without signs of storm or rot. Each of these descriptions matched markers associated in modern psychiatric profiling with conduct disorder presentations. The reanalysis showed that a substantial proportion of unresolved juvenile-related fatalities carried traits deeply consistent with what Timothy had shown as a boy: cruelty without remorse, fascination with accident and injury, and calculated detachment from sorrow. This is what scholars call the statistical ghost, that spectral presence which emerges not through direct memory but through numbers, patterns, and repetition. Timothy himself fades into ambiguity. The records never confirm beyond doubt that he traveled through Iowa or Nebraska or Kansas. Yet his traits become visible again whenever statistical analysis reveals clusters of cases sharing the same disturbing hallmarks. In this way, the ghost is not Timothy as an individual, but Timothy as representative of a broader phenomenon: the child whose pathology escaped notice and whose consequences multiplied invisibly through the categories of misfortune and chance. The re-examination of these records drives home an unsettling recognition. Timothy may have been remembered precisely because Harding and hospital staff documented him so carefully, but many others like him vanished into overlooked files and unexamined coroner's notes. Their behaviors were never named, their patterns never noticed, and the tragedies around them entered history as mere mishaps. What the numbers now reveal is that Timothy was not singular, he was emblematic. Archival aggregation shows that overlooked conduct disorder traits have marked a significant proportion of so-called accidental deaths involving juvenile presence. The failure to recognize those markers in real time left communities vulnerable, crafting decades of invisible continuity between isolated small-town reports. To place Timothy within this statistical frame is to recognize that his significance lies not only in what he did, but in what he represents. Rather than being an anomaly whose life story stands apart, he becomes a representative figure, an illustration of how failing to see the warning signs of conduct disorder in children allows patterns of harm to persist unconnected. His presence returns across documents not as a boy walking through counties, but as the repetition of traits traced by later research. The statistical ghost is the reminder that unseen pathology travels farther than memory ever suspected. In viewing Timothy through this lens, the focus shifts from one farm or one county to an entire structure of societal blindness. The communities he passed through registered tragedies as accidents, the hospital that confined him rewarded deception as healing, and the archives recorded entries without ever combining them into a bigger picture. Only modern aggregation uncovers the through line, giving shape once more to the outline of a child whose behaviors were misunderstood but not unique. And it is here that the story presses against its most difficult realization. Timothy Caldwell's significance is not limited to his own past. His features echo across the records of many unnamed children left misjudged and untreated. This perspective forces us to ask how many Timothys existed, their presence written down only in statistics rather than stories. That expression, the ghost revealed not by memory but by numbers, points directly toward the lesson his history carries. Lessons from Timothy. Timothy Caldwell's story leaves us with lessons that reach beyond the farm fields of Missouri or the locked wards of the state hospital. His case matters not only because of what he did, but because of what the people around him failed to see. The value of his history lies in understanding those blind spots, measuring what has changed since, and asking why those same oversights remain so dangerous if repeated today. The first lesson is rooted in historical failure. In Timothy's world, grief from the war and limited medical knowledge combined to create a setting where warning signs went unnoticed. Neighbors praised his stillness as strength, teachers saw his obedience as discipline, and doctors could only gesture vaguely at moral insanity. In truth, the red flags were visible: cruelty to animals, lack of grief at others' deaths, fascination with injury, and calm detachment in moments of tragedy. Yet each of these features was explained away. War had hardened everyone, so a hardened child did not alarm anyone. Illness and debt consumed families, so tragedies were understood as bad luck rather than hints of something darker. The result was a pattern of silence, a reluctance to name pathology in someone so young. Instead of interpreting his behaviors as danger, the community reframed them as admirable qualities. This failure illustrates how cultural expectations and medical limitations reinforced each other to blind observers to a child's escalating risks. The second lesson is how modern systems respond differently, at least when the signs are named. Today, psychiatry has the DSM-5 criteria for conduct disorder, with the limited prosocial emotions specifier for children marked by lack of remorse, empathy, or emotional depth. Timothy fits what would now be considered a highly concerning cluster of traits. Clinicians now recognize that repeated cruelty toward animals, combined with flat affect and manipulative behaviors, signals a subgroup of children at far greater risk for persistent violence. In child and adolescent psychiatric settings, these children are identified in the single-digit percentage range, small but critically important due to the weight their behaviors carry in long-term outcomes. The modern approach emphasizes intervention, not simply observation. Therapeutic programs focused on empathy building, structured supervision, and family involvement. While these protocols cannot promise transformation, they can interrupt escalation, a chance Timothy never had. Yet even within today's framework, caution remains. DSM-5 itself advises restraint in forensic contexts, noting that labels must be applied carefully, especially where legal consequences follow. Clinicians are directed to describe behaviors precisely rather than define a child as inherently psychopathic. Modern tools create opportunities for early response, but they must be used with care and precision. The third lesson is moral and practical, addressing the question of what communities choose to do once warning signs appear. Timothy's case shows why screening and early intervention matter, because missed signs don't disappear, they convert into long-term risk. Silence permitted his early cruelties to continue unchecked. Neighbors rationalized them as misfortune, physicians lacked terms to describe them, and caretakers mistook them for virtues. Each decision to avoid suspicion allowed escalation to continue in plain sight. This is not just a matter of historical curiosity. Today, teachers, parents, and juvenile systems still hesitate to acknowledge cruelty or detachment in children. The idea feels too disturbing, too contrary to the image of childhood innocence. But avoidance is a dangerous comfort. As history shows, inaction strengthens pathology, giving it space to mature into calculated control. The lesson is not simply to recognize risk, but to act on it. To resist the temptation of reinterpreting cruelty as curiosity or stillness as resilience. These three takeaways connect Timothy's story to broader implications. Historically, his environment failed him by turning clear red flags into noble qualities. Today, systems can identify such children with more accuracy, but face the challenge of balancing intervention with ethical caution in applying labels. Yet the ultimate lesson is not technical, it is ethical. Recognition cannot stop at awareness. Communities must confront the discomfort of naming danger in children and commit to intervening before harm accumulates. Every detail of Timothy's life illustrates what happens when that step is skipped. His silence teaches that pathology can masquerade as strength when viewed through the wrong lens. His coded writings, discovered in the hospital, show how manipulation grows unchecked when rewarded. His escape mirrors what happens when appearances are mistaken for truth. Each stage of his life reminds us that pathology untreated does not dissolve. It changes, adapts, and progresses. That is why Timothy is not only a case from the past, but a warning for the present. The lesson is stark. Early recognition of cruelty and absence of remorse is a matter of prevention, not just description. Without timely response, the traits visible in a child can harden into the structures of enduring violence in adults. Statistical reviews, case studies, and modern treatment programs all point in the same direction, that the danger lies not only in the pathology itself, but in the silence that surrounds it. Identifying these traits is necessary but not sufficient. Acting upon them is what alters trajectories. Timothy's life stands as evidence of what unfolds when that action never comes. The question left for us is not whether Timothy was unique, but what his remembered story should compel us to do. His name survived because one doctor wrote obsessively, because attendants filed notes, because fragments were preserved. Countless others went unseen, their cruelty mistaken for resilience, their silence read as strength, their warning signs lost to history. Timothy's story proves that these children exist, they have always existed, and avoiding their presence only deepens the damage they cause. With the frameworks now available, we can no longer claim ignorance. The responsibility lies not in observing pathology, but in refusing to let it remain invisible. This is Timothy's final lesson. The costs of dismissal are always higher than the discomfort of recognition. Ignoring cruelty in children is not neutral, it is an act that allows danger to mature. Communities once explained his behavior away as misfortune or maturity. Systems today, if negligent, risk doing the same with children who show the same signs. The tools to intervene exist. The moral test lies in whether they are used. And it is with this recognition that we move to the most difficult truth Timothy Caldwell forces us to confront, that cruelty and calculation can be seated in childhood itself, and history offers little comfort about what follows if we choose to look away. Timothy Caldwell's story reminds us how easily early cruelty, left unexplained or excused, can grow into lasting harm. In his time, silence and misinterpretation allowed warning signs to pass unchallenged, signs we now recognize as predictors of risk and escalation. His life shows that ignoring what feels unsettling can shape outcomes far beyond one child or one family. What would you have done faced with Timothy in 1867? Share your thoughts below. And if this story intrigued you, subscribe. Our next deep dive will explore how modern systems try, and sometimes fail, to interrupt paths that begin in childhood.